It's the 24th of August, 1873. It's about 2 o'clock in the morning, and lying in a turnip field just along from the main high street is the body of a policeman. He's covered in blood, he's missing his truncheon, and it appears that he has been battered to death. That police officer was PC Israel May, and his death would change the way policing in Kent and the UK was viewed forever. Today I'm going to retrace PC Israel May's steps, and we're going to find out exactly what happened on this tragic summer's evening. This is the death of PC Israel May.
So, to take us back to 1873, it had been a beautiful sunny summer's day in August, and in Snodland in Kent in the UK, some had perhaps been enjoying their day a little too much. It was around midnight when an angry drunk made his way down to the ferry crossing at Snodland and demanded the ferryman take him across the River Medway so he could get home. The drunk was 27-year-old labourer Thomas Atkins, or more locally known as Tommy Atkins. He was absolutely furious because, in his drunken state, he had somehow run across the local police constable, and they'd had a little bit of an argy-bargy, shall we say. What he claimed is that he'd been hustled off of the street by this policeman, possibly understandably so if he was completely blind raging drunk, but anyway, according to the ferryman, he'd threatened to mark the bobby if he ever got the chance. And 1 week later, Atkins was back in Snodland, and again, he was drunk.
It was probably here, just next to All Saints Church, with the River Medway literally behind me here, that Atkins tried to make that ferry crossing, meaning this story started where it unfortunately was destined to end.
He'd spent the evening of the 23rd of August drinking at the Bull Inn, and again, around midnight when he probably should have been heading back home, he was staggering around outside.
Behind me, the Bull Inn is one of the few remaining buildings that would have been here at the time. It's not quite the same as it was then, it's a co-op now, but here is where the Bull Inn was and where both Atkins and PC Israel May's nights began and ended. Wandering around the old Bull Inn, you can almost smell the beer and hear the raucous laughter. Yeah, not really.
And this is where PC Israel May stepped in. Being the local police constable, he was probably expecting to be needed outside the village pub. And I'd imagine he immediately recognised Atkins when he arrived as the loudmouth drunk from the week before. And for Atkins, with the target of his ire suddenly appearing, he started complaining loudly about PC May and making drunken threats in his direction.
Atkins was apparently stumbling around, cursing PC Israel May as much as he could, and generally being a bit of a nuisance. Before, at about midnight, finally wandering up the road to pass out behind a hedge.
Seeing that he'd actually fallen through a hedge into a field and passed out, PC May decided that he should probably go and try and wake him up so that he could actually get home, because drunks lying about in fields isn't exactly a good look for the village.
He tried to rouse him awake, but was unsuccessful, and so decided it wasn't worth his trouble, and he carried on up here. It would have been pitch black and very quiet, apart from the odd people making their way home from the inn. Now, around here, obviously Snodland is much bigger now, and I'm still in it, but at the time, Snodland was back there. He would have crossed the parish boundary and now be in a place called Ham Hill. Just a good example of how settlements tend to develop over time, is you have lots of small villages and then slowly over the years they expand and join up to create bigger villages and towns. Around here in Ham Hill, he had a conversation with a woman at about 1:30 in the morning. They said their goodbyes, and PC May started to make his way back down the road towards Snodland and towards the Bull Inn.
And in recounting their conversation, she recalled seeing his buttons shining in the darkness as he walked away from her.
And that woman would be the last person to see Israel May alive. It's hard to put yourself in his place that evening, because he knew that Atkins was probably still down there passed out behind this hedge. He knew Atkins hated him, so he knew that if he got back down there and he was awake, then he was very likely to have a confrontation. What he couldn't know was how badly that confrontation would go. You also have to remember at this point that this is the early days of the police force. Like, as we know from this story, no police officer had been killed in the line of duty before. For somebody like PC Israel May, I'd imagine the last thing he would have been thinking was that his life was in danger that night. And as PC May would have walked these last few meters, Atkins would have been just ahead, still unconscious, behind this hedge.
At 6:15 in the morning, a local bricklayer who was on his way to work was walking past that hedge and that turnip field that Atkins had fallen asleep in. As he was walking along the road, he glanced over the hedge and spotted something. Not immediately realizing what he was seeing, he looked a little closer and realized that he was staring at the body of a man. And from what he could see and the scene around the body, it was clear the man was dead. Leaving the body where it was, he immediately found a friend to go and fetch PC Israel May. But after not being able to find PC May and returning to the scene of the crime and taking a closer look at the body, they had a horrifying realization. The body lying before them in the field was PC Israel May.
And it was here, on the corner of what is now Rockfort Road, just behind me, that PC May's body was discovered. I think it's pretty safe to say that it's a fair bit busier here than it was that day in 1873. I mean, there certainly wasn't a garage right in the corner and a kebab shop across the road.
Now, by this point, a bit of a ruckus had kicked off. Obviously, this was not that far from the main high street in Snodland, where people would have been waking up and going about their day. And so the hubbub and the number of people who came over to see what had happened was huge. In fact, by the time the local superintendent arrived, apparently there were between 100 and 200 people all over the crime scene, tramping all over the road and the field. Upon inspecting May's corpse, it was clear that he'd been beaten about the head with a blunt instrument. And as the PC's truncheon was missing, nowhere to be found, it was assumed that the murderer must have used that. Next to the body, they found one of a pair of braces. And not belonging to PC May, it was assumed that they'd probably been pulled away and ripped from the murderer during a violent fight. And there were other signs of the violence of this fight in the immediate area. Closer to the road and the hedge, they found the constable's police cap, his handcuffs, and another man's blood-stained cloth cap. And pretty much everything they found was covered in blood. And actually, through the hedge and onto the road, there were bloody footprints that looked to be heading onto the road and away from Snodland. The last thing they found was his watch, still tucked into the pocket of his uniform and stopped at 2:40 a.m. Once the crowd had been dispersed, the scene of the crime noted, and the evidence gathered, May's body was moved to the Bull Inn. And the following day there was an inquest, where a local jury very, very quickly returned a verdict of willful murder. And Snodland being a very small village at the time, and pretty much everybody knowing everybody else, the feeling was that it wouldn't take long to track down the murderer. The first port of call was the river, obviously this being a huge transport link in the area. They immediately assumed that whoever had done this may have tried to escape by boat. And so barges were searched, but not a lot was found. Apparently 2 soldiers had been seen acting suspiciously at the time, but turned out to be deserters. And so the manhunt continued. But the conflict between PC Israel May and Atkins was well known in the area. And as Atkins had not returned home, he was very quickly assumed to be the main suspect. And the second bloody cap that was found in the field was identified as belonging to Tommy Atkins. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and descriptions of Atkins were circulated around the country. 6 more days followed after the murder, and Atkins had still not been found, which amongst the local community was considered unbelievable because this was not a well-connected and well-funded man. He couldn't really have made it that far, and definitely had no way to leave the country, and local papers were ever doubtful that this case was going to be solved. But the Saturday morning after the murder, in a place near Kingsdown, near Rootham, so only a few miles away, Atkins was found, arrested, and taken into custody. And when you read the descriptions of what Atkins looked like when he was found, it's unbelievable that he wasn't found sooner. Or at the very least, he must have been just hiding in a hole for a week. The vest he was wearing and the tattered shirt underneath were completely blood-stained. His trousers were also covered in blood, although it seemed that he tried to wipe some of it off, and those trousers were only being held up by one half of a pair of braces, which were an exact match for the other half that was found at the murder scene. Atkins also had a cut on his head, and it looked like he had a black eye that was starting to recover. At his trial, apparently Atkins cried bitterly, whilst pleading not guilty to murder. He claimed that PC Israel May had hit him on the head with his truncheon, and then they'd struggled, falling through the hedge into the field. He then confirmed that during their struggle, he had grabbed a hold of PC May's truncheon, or what he called a staff, and hit him on the head 5 or 6 times. Now, had Atkins been convicted of murder, he would have been guaranteed a mandatory death sentence. But his defense argued that there had been no malice aforethought, or ultimately that this was a spur-of-the-moment action in the middle of a fight, and that Atkins had not been planning to kill Israel May. It was also taken into account that Atkins was generally considered by his landlord and his colleagues and friends to be a quiet, well-mannered young man. But this went against the fact that Atkins did have a history of threatening behaviour, and it was found that his own father had been tried for the murder of his wife, and was ultimately found to be insane. Ultimately, the jury found him not guilty of murder, but of manslaughter, and so Atkins was spared the death sentence. The judge at the trial did agree that if PC Israel May had hit Atkins first, then he perhaps could not be held solely responsible, but that conflicted with the fact that PC Israel May had been so violently beaten about the head, and there could have been no way that Atkins did not realise he was killing PC Israel May. Atkins was jailed for 20 years. With his death, PC Israel May became the first police constable from the Kent Constabulary to be killed on duty. There had actually been earlier deaths in places such as Dover, but this was the first recorded killing of a Kent police officer in the line of duty.
So I am just walking down what actually used to be the old High Street towards All Saints Church, where PC May was buried. And during my research, I actually discovered something interesting that you would probably not be able to tell just by looking at the street today. This road ends in a bypass, in a pretty busy bypass. And that bypass actually cuts off part of Snodland, including All Saints Church, from this whole section of Snodland. But you used to be able to just walk straight down this road to the church. In fact, you could stand here and see it in the distance. And that is not really the case anymore. In fact, this building here, this house here, is kind of the last remaining sign of really what this all used to look like. And behind me here actually used to be, well, you can see, it's called Red Lion House. This isn't the old building that used to be here, but there was a pub here called the Red Lion, which was unfortunately demolished, even though they did try to save it from the wrath of the bypass. I'm sure it's got its uses, but I think I probably would have preferred it the way it used to be as well. It is sad, having walked PC Israel May's final steps to now actually be walking on what was ultimately his last journey to the church.
Israel May's funeral took place on the 28th of August here at All Saints Church in Snodland. The church was absolutely full with mourners, including many police officers from across the county.
Here in front of me is the memorial to Israel May. And obviously, as unfortunate as his death was, it holds a very important place in history, in our history, and in the history of the police force in this country. And it's a shame that we couldn't say that with his death, it was the first and the last of deaths of police officers whilst on duty, but unfortunately not the case. And in my family, there's a fairly long history of people who've served in the police. And so this one hits a little closer to home for me because I see him here and it makes me think of what could have happened to my family members at any point. I mean, they were in very dangerous situations just like Israel May was, and fortunately are still around today to tell their stories, which unfortunately Israel May never got the chance to do. It's important to remember that he was only 37 years old, but 10 years older than Atkins, who was 27. But being that much older, it meant Israel May had obviously had time to start and grow a family. And so when he died, he left behind his wife and 3 children. And his poor wife was certainly not new to tragedy.
Tragically, P.C. May and his wife, Elizabeth, had suffered tragedy before. In the 2 years before his death, they'd lost their infant daughter in 1871 and son in 1872. And in what must have been seen as trying to do Elizabeth a favour or a kindness, because she was so grief-stricken by not just the loss of her husband, but these 2 prior losses, she was forbidden from attending his funeral. But despite not being given the chance to finally say goodbye to her husband, a local fund was raised to help her, and the total amount raised was £504, 12 shillings and 3 pence, which is about £47,000 in 2025. 500 of that was invested into a mortgage for her. And we actually have the vicar's address from Israel May's funeral, which was particularly heartfelt. We have met together to pay our last respects to the memory of a brave man who had fallen in the discharge of a duty entrusted to him by the public. No one knew what he had gone through on that terrible night. Few could imagine what dangers a policeman has to face, while his fellow creatures could safely sleep. The sympathy and respect shown to his memory at once testified to the integrity, honour, and purity of his character. It was only very recently that the deceased visited, in this very churchyard, the grave of his little child. How little did he think, in the full strength of life, that he would so soon be laid there himself. Israel May was buried next to the grave of his 2-year-old son, Edward. And unfortunately for Elizabeth, the tragedy did not end there. Whilst she herself died in 1907 at the age of 70, she died having spent her last years living with her daughter, her only surviving child. Of the 3 children her and Israel had at the time of his death, her 2 sons would also pass away. Her 8-year-old son Frank in 1880, and her last son, Digby Lawrence May, died of dysentery in India at the age of 35.
And as with so many other stories like this, an important reminder of the dangers that our emergency services put themselves in on a daily basis. And no matter what you think of the police force, because I know that can be a divisive subject these days, I think you can at the very least understand and empathise with the tragic loss of a father, a husband, a man. So I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all that really helps me out as always, and I'll see you in the next one.